Okay, this is one addressed to me, and of course, I hope everyone we can all respond to it. But it says, "Your book, Surviving Death, makes a compelling case for the existence of our consciousness beyond death." Thank you for that. Some ufologists have pointed out the similarities between UAP abductions and near-death experiences. They take place in a similar state of consciousness. Do you believe that some NHI are residing in the spirit or astral realm? Okay, well, that's a really interesting question. In terms of the last part, oh, thank you for showing the book cover. I can't really say where NHI dwell and what the different realms are and what they mean. But in thinking about abductions and NDEs, I actually think there's a lot of differences. I mean, the similarities are obvious. That often they're in some kind of altered state of consciousness. They're going into some other kind of dimension or reality that is not part of our normal physical waking world. But I mean, I also think there's a lot of differences between those two experiences. And I'm going to frame the abduction experience as being one that is actually a physical, real experience, because so many of the abductees really want it to be recognized as a physical experience, that they were actually taken against their will into a ship and then brought back. And so looking at it that way, the NDE is very different. I mean, when a person has a near death experience, they're actually physically dead and they're unconscious and they're traumatized because they've died basically. And then their consciousness goes into this other realm and has this very usually very positive experience. So they come back with this extremely positive recollection of what happened to them, and they're not afraid of death, and it's immediately kind of something that's life changing in a very positive way. Whereas an abduction experience does not have that effect on people. It's usually, especially if we're looking at the ones that they describe as being very physical, they're terrifying, they're traumatized. If you look at, the story of Whitley Strieber and many other people, what they went through in terms of coping with the physical effects and the psychological effects of these experiences that happened against their will. And so, I think also abductions often occur with people throughout their lives. It's something that happens when you're a child, whereas a near death experience usually will just happen once. And again, it's associated with being dead. So I think they're quite different. And even I think what one thing that's interesting though is that both of them open up the mind and expand the mind dramatically. And people often will develop greater perceptual abilities after these two experiences, whether it be, greater abilities to perceive and to have things like clairvoyance or precognition and all the things that are kind of opened up. And an example being the case of Elizabeth Crone, who had a near-death experience and then had all these things happen to her. So that often happens too after an abduction, but I think in essence they're quite different. So I don't know. That's just my perception. And if you, Jacques and Jeff would like to add to that and give us your sense of of how they interconnect, that would be great.
I think this is precisely the conversation we should be having, right? I mean, this is it. I mean, clearly they're related and clearly they're different, and it's that physicality that Willie speaks of very eloquently, but also Karen Austin speaks to that same
Yeah.
physicality very, very clearly. Uh, but the near-death experiences, they have their own physicality too. I mean, Elizabeth Crone you mentioned, I mean, she was literally struck by lightning. I mean, they talk about physicality. So there is again, I just wanna say that's the conversation we should be having. I don't think we know how they're connected, but they seem to be connected, but they're also very different. I know that doesn't that's not satisfying, but I think that's obviously the case.
I think that's the case too. It's just hard to, and I'm fascinated with trying to find those connections. I think all of us are, but it's very difficult to do that.
You have to, as a culture, though, you have to acknowledge that those events happened to have that conversation. This is the deeper point. You can't have that conversation until you acknowledge those experiences as part of the human reality.
It seems that near-death experiences have more recognition than abductions, really. They're
Well, only recently, right? I mean,
Yeah, recently, and they're more similar to each other, and they've been written about by medical doctors, and, lots of studies have been done on them and so on. And
yeah, this is
it's I
this
guess
is
Or mainstream.
This is where my eyes roll a bit because it's always the doctors, right? It's people in white coats
I know.
that authorize the conversation, and I don't mean to dismiss medical doctors at all. I'm just saying, why do we need the medical doctor to affirm something that people have been talking about for a long, long time? Why do we do that? That's the deeper question that I really wanna answer.
I think the answer is because in order to create a paradigm shift that ripples up into the
I know.
British world, we have to do it that way or it's not
No.
gonna penetrate.
I know. I know that answer, and that answer is correct, but
I
it's just disappointing to me.
I understand that, but that's sort of what my job has been to try and do.
Yeah. Well, guess what? Jacques' farmers. The farmers are seeing the UFOs and having the encounters too. It's
That
not
just
just military people.
isn't gonna take them seriously, but they're gonna take the doctor seriously. That's the bottom line, and that's just how it is. We need both. We need both.
Ma Many people spontaneously, many witnesses relate the 2 things. Or they think that they've seen something, it's an omen. People around the world, in other cultures would do that also, thinking if you see a UFO, it may be an omen of death. It could be a prediction of death. I enjoyed your book, Leslie, yeah, and you brought in some of the leading thinkers into this, and both from the physiology and from the physics and the metaphysics. Um, there is a French scientist named Flammarion, F-L-A, like a flame, Flammarion, who was an astronomer, who was a very prolific writer about science, and especially about astronomy, in the early 20th century and first half of the 20th century. And I collected some of his books because they were so well done describing phenomena in the sky. But he also wrote about death. And he he wrote 3 books. One is Manifestations of the Living, Manifestations at Death, and Manifestations Beyond Death.
Mm.
And I thought that was, and I'm starting to reread those 3 books because it's an interesting, it should be just one thing. I mean, essentially, a ghost shows up and tells you something or says, I'm your great grandmother and you should buy this kind of car. Or they say, or they just make an impact at an emotional level. You see a shadow passing from one room to another. And in fact, it is an omen of something happening, somebody that's very close to you who is dying far away, and you're going to find out later. Or it could be that you have a message just like that from somebody who is still alive. And I spoke to a ghost researcher here in San Francisco who is very dedicated and doing it very scientifically. And he told me you get the same kinds of reports from people. He was called into a room by somebody who was trying to sell that house. And the reason people were not buying the house was that in the house there were people speaking and people engaging in all kinds of discussions. And he, studied the house, spent time there day and night and so on. And he found the people who were the voices that were going on in the room. They were a young couple who had moved away to a different house, but they were still alive. And people in the house were hearing conversations they had or they had had before, but they were not dead. They were not ghosts at all. They were just flesh and bones people. Okay, so and this is San Francisco today, and we have lots of haunted houses, as you know, close to here. And of course, beyond death, the information we get is very different from the information we have at death or before death. So I think that's a useful definition. Now, in the meantime, parapsychology has moved on in parallel to studies of death and studies of communication beyond death. And now we have manifestations of parapsychological phenomena at a distance among people who may or may not be dead. So I think we have to look at that, because what if the communication, you see your grandmother, and your grandmother says that you should be careful when you're driving today, and you drive today and you have an accident. Well, maybe it was your subconscious telling you that, and then manifesting your grandmother as a way to get your attention. Because if it's not manifested by someone you know, you're not going to pay attention to the message. And we know that our consciousness can anticipate the future, can see that you're going to have an accident this afternoon, and is in some ways trying to warn you by manifesting. So there was in the Bigelow board, the board of NDEs, not BAS. NDEs was in many ways more interesting. There was a general, an Air Force general, who specialized in instrumentation, especially the effect of high acceleration, under essentially also under combat conditions for young pilots in fighters, in fighter jets, where they need to make drastic maneuvers and so on, and they lose consciousness in those maneuvers. Now, when you put them in a centrifuge, which is what he was doing, you can make them lose consciousness also. And for a 19-year-old pilot, who wants to get into the jet, he doesn't believe that he's going to lose consciousness. And you can make him lose consciousness. And then you interrogate him about, what happened. Now, this general told us, he gave us a lecture about consciousness outside the body, including what he had experienced, because he was putting himself in the centrifuges, and he was asking to be sent to different speeds of rotation. And he had, in some cases, been outside his body, where he could see himself walking, and he was about 3 or 4 feet behind his body, walking down the hall. Okay, so when you study that at that level, you find that consciousness can be has many ways of being extracted outside of the body, and so where does it go when the body is no longer functioning? Can it still manifest? And that's he showed us some movies or some tapes of pilots in an F-18 that was diving to the ground because the pilot had gone unconscious. And when the pilot regained consciousness and could pull the jet out of the dive and survive, he was asking, what happened to you? And very often the pilot had a dream. One of them I remember very clearly, the F-16 diving to the ground. The pilot had a dream that he was opening gifts. This was that his children had given him. Okay? It was very peaceful. And he was in an F-16 that was diving. So consciousness is, and at that point he was just out of the ability to control anything around him. And when you talk to people who have been in those extreme conditions, that speaks to the domain of the phenomena you're describing, Leslie. And the question is, how do we discriminate about the physical conditions, and how do we know where? And that applies to abductions. People are taken into a, a physical universe where they have no control. They may have. I remember speaking to the Hills, Betty and Barney Hills, and with the doctor who hypnotized them, and asking the doctor, what can you do with that? Where were they? And if and he said, I have no way of answering your question. And this was again someone who had studied hypnosis of people who had been at war and so on. He was in the army in World War II as a psychiatrist, using hypnosis. And
Right.
so we now have to take all of that together and review it in new ways. And that's going to be very difficult. That's going,
Well,
we're at the beginning of that.
an endless and ongoing process, Jacques, that will never
Yes.
end.
Yes. And books like yours are just, steps to that. And
Well, thank you very
I want
much.
to
Yeah.
go back to Flammarion and extract the actual interviews that he did. Not all the theories around it that were still 19th century theories about ghosts and so on, but which are relevant. But I like the fact that manifestations of to the living, of the dying, the actual observing the process of that, and then revenant, the consciousness coming back.
Right. Sounds like fascinating books. I assume they're not translated into English, though, correct?
I have not found English translations. There may have been at a time.